We do not have enough out-of-conference college football games. This bothers me each and every year. So we're going to play the games here on Big 12 Breakdown. I'm Mark Rogers TV. We bring on the best bloggers in Big 12 each and every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, 8 o'clock Central Time, typically just a slight change in programming plans this week. So we've got Sean Cordy from Today's U on the line, as well as Thomas Fleming from Cowboys Ride for Free. So we did it last week where we matched up the Big 12 versus the Pac-12, and what a showdown it was. We took the 10 teams in the Big 12. We tapped the two middle teams in the Pac-12, and so we lined them up and seeded the teams based on conference standings. And we each had a vote, and therefore we played 40 mythical games, and it finished 20-20, Thomas. 20-20 against the Pac-12 last week. So now we've got the Big 12 against the ACC. So we're going to match up these games. So what I had to do, and I thought this was only fair, so my initial approach was going to be to take the 5 top teams in the ACC and the 5 bottom teams in the ACC. But I didn't feel completely good about gutting the middle portion of the ACC. So I took the top 3 of the ACC. Then I took out a team, then I took the next 2, then I took out a team, then I took the next 3, and I took out a team, then I took the next 2, and I took out a team. So that's what we did with the ACC to eliminate 4 teams. That includes, off the top of my head, Pitt's not there, Boston College, so an easy win out of the way for the Big 12, wasn't able to take advantage of the Boston College Eagles, and 2 other teams in the ACC are gone. So these seedings are based on conference record, then overall record, and then head-to-head play. So, Thomas, we'll start out with the matchup that is somewhat familiar to us, Clemson and Oklahoma. So, of course, the 2 champions of the 2 leagues would play again, and we're taking 2015's teams, and we're going to match them up. But, of course, we already saw this one. So, Clemson, Oklahoma. Who wins that one if they play again?
I would have to say Clemson. It was a close game for a while there, but Clemson came out fairly handily for a game of that importance. And I sure heard it from a lot of OU fans, that's for sure, just how ugly it was. And I didn't, I'm not critical of them because that's not the team that I support, but all my OU friends were very frustrated with how that game went. And Clemson played well, and they played well in the national championship against Alabama. So I would have to get that. I'd have to give the leg up to the Tigers.
Right, Sean. Obviously, we already saw it, but that doesn't mean that it's one game. It could be played again and with the different results. So if Clemson and Oklahoma suited up again, who would you like?
In the next game, I would like Clemson. Take another game with those 2, and I think Oklahoma wins. But for the most part, I would take Clemson. They just run out so much faster than Oklahoma did. Their pass rush completely destroyed the fairly inexperienced Oklahoma offensive line. And that was really the key to that game. I don't see them getting around that. Baker Mayfield's a great mobile quarterback, but he can only do so much by himself. And if Clemson locks down with their cornerbacks like they did, it's a really hard matchup for the Sooners to take over. So I take Clemson.
And that's what really stood out to me. I said the same thing. We just went on with some ACC bloggers or Pac-12 bloggers in matching of Oklahoma and Stanford, actually. Clemson with a more fearsome pass rush and freakish athletes up front than Stanford. But that's what I took away from that game more than anything. It was a close game for a half. It was a 1-point game. And then Clemson took over in the second half because they started to run the ball with Wayne Gallman, and also the pass protection for Baker Mayfield. For as mobile as he is, he was just running for his life the entire second half in that one, with Clemson winning 37-17. All right, so we go to the number 2 seeds in this one. Thomas, we got North Carolina from the ACC against Oklahoma State. Of course, North Carolina did match up in postseason play against a Big 12 team and were completely outclassed against Baylor in losing 49-38, and it wasn't that close. Thomas, we got North Carolina. We got Oklahoma State, who I'm thinking that you guys don't necessarily think is the second best team in the Big 12, but that's the way the standings stack up.
Here I would have to give the edge to OSU, and I know that seems like a homer choice considering that, I write about OSU football, but There's reasoning behind that. North Carolina, they were a talented team, obviously, led under head coach Larry Fedora, who was actually the offensive coordinator at Oklahoma State. They have a talented quarterback who leads the offense, and Marquise Wilson, I believe. Williams, correct. Marquise Williams, a lot of talent on that team. Quinshaw Davis. And then defensively, they have Shaquille Rashad, Sam Smiley, a lot of talent on the defense. But they had a truly their defense struggled specifically in the run game. They were 121st out of 127 teams in the FBS on the ground. That's OSU's only weakness. If anyone out there has watched a game with OSU, they can tell right off the bat that the Cowboys did not have a run game at all. But against North Carolina, in a hypothetical situation, I see OSU maybe getting, I don't know, I think 100 yards is pretty out there personally, but like 80 yards, 85, 90 yards, something like that, which could give them a little bit of balance. So I'd have to give the edge to OSU. Also, Marquise Williams is, in my opinion, the best player for the Tar Heels, and the Cowboys have experience defending against players like that. You think of Trayvon Boykin with TCU. That's one that particularly comes to mind, and they held him in check pretty well when those two teams played in Stillwater. So I'd have to give the edge to Oklahoma State.
So, Sean, we got North Carolina with Marquise Williams, as noted there, a senior quarterback who played extremely well in leading North Carolina to the ACC championship game. They played a much tougher schedule the last two games when they finally hit Clemson, and then the bowl game against Baylor, as we noted, taking on an Oklahoma State team that shot out at 10-0 before getting trounced by some superior competition those last three games. So similar storylines for these two teams in 2015.
Yeah, I think he hit it on the head. For a while, I was thinking I would go with UNC, but they match up pretty well, as he noted, that Oklahoma State's really only weakness is their run game. And as we saw against Baylor when they shattered NCAA records against them, even a middling team could possibly get something of a run game going, whether that be with Carson or Rennie Childs. And I would even think that J.W. Walsh, considering Baylor's success running the ball back, Walsh could be a huge part of that game too, especially at the goal line. So that could be the X factor in this hypothetical right now. I'd give the edge.
This is a difficult one for me. I think that both of these teams overachieved last year. I don't think they're the second best teams in the league, their respective conferences. You guys are swaying me a bit. North Carolina's defense is much improved from 2015, going back to 2014 with Gene Chizik at defensive coordinator, but not that much improved. And we saw it in postseason play against Baylor. I think Oklahoma State ekes out an entertaining win over North Carolina there. So we got a clean sweep for the Big 12 in the number 2 matchup. Okay, third-seeded matchup. Since we've seen Clemson and Oklahoma already play, I've got to say, guys, that this would be the game that I would want to see over the rest of them. This would be the number 1 matchup for me. Florida State, and it wasn't a vintage Florida State team, but still very athletic, very, very talented, taking on a TCU team that lost Josh Doxson 2/3 through the season. Of course, Trayvon Boykin couldn't finish the campaign either. So, Thomas, keep in mind that we're playing at full strength. So we get all the players back, everybody's healthy, and we go at it. Florida State and TCU.
Well, if they were to play at the end of the season, I'd have to give the edge to Florida State. But considering in this situation that both teams have all of their players, I'd have to give it to TCU. And especially if they're playing at the end of the season, you look at how Florida State played in their bowl game against Houston in a 38-24 loss. Sean McGuire threw 5 interceptions. And that's something that is concerning if you're an outsider looking at that game. TCU secondary was young. They struggled. But considering how McGuire played in that game, if you were to replace Houston with TCU, I could easily see Horned Frogs getting at least 2 or 3 of those 5 interceptions in a hypothetical situation. Also, I just think Trayvon Boykin and Josh Doxson, that's one of the best duos in the Big 12 when they were both playing. That team has so much talent, and specifically on the offense, the mixture of talent and scheme is something that is very special with TCU, and something that, as an OSU fan, I am looking for. I've been looking for a long time. But under Sonny Dykes and who was their co-offensive coordinator? They have co-offensive coordinators.
Meacham.
Yes, Doug Meacham. That's one of the best co-offensive coordinators. I mean, they do such a great job. So I'd have to get the edge to TCU on that one.
All right. I think you're coming up with Sonny Cumbie there with Sonny Dykes.
Yes, Sonny Dykes.
Coast. But
Potato.
yeah, Sean, I got to say, Florida State and TCU, for me, this is an amazing matchup. I think a couple programs had underachieved for different reasons last year. So who do you like in this one?
It's a really tough game for me, actually, considering I really like Dalvin Cook. I personally was betting for him as a Heisman candidate, but that didn't come to fruition, sadly. And TCU, they were banged up on defense, so we don't really know how good their defense would have been had they had all their starters coming into the year as expected. So we still can't really look at that too much, considering they were down at the get-go. But Dalvin Cook played tremendous every single year. His only bad game was against Boston College, surprisingly. So, but even considering that, Trayvon Boykin, Josh Jackson coming at full force on offense, that's a team that could possibly, and I think could, go over this Florida State very athletic defense. And I'd take the TCU by
maybe not so surprising, Sean, that Boston College pretty much ranked across the board in the top 3 in the nation in rush defense, total defense, points against.
Sure.
They were extremely strong defensively. Their just offense was so anemic. Florida State just didn't really click on offense. Eric Olson turned the ball over a ton the previous season. He actually didn't turn it over this year, but they were so conservative on offense. And it's surprising that they really didn't have the playmakers on the outside that they have in the past at Florida State. And it became Dalvin Cook, to your point, Sean, defeating teams like Wake Forest by 5 or 6 points. South Florida, they were in a close game. And basically, Dalvin Cook bailed them out of those games with like remarkable runs against inferior opponents. To your argument, Thomas, Florida State limped to the finish line. And, of course, we saw TCU with a remarkable comeback in the bowl game. So I like TCU in a flat-out entertaining game. Would love to see those kind of athletes on the field together, Florida State and TCU. So now we've got the 4 seed in each conference, Louisville. They got off to a rough start because they had a tough schedule out of the gate. They had Houston. They had Auburn. They lost to Clemson. They were 0-3 at one point. They finished strong, defeated Texas A&M in a bowl game. They take on Baylor. And Baylor's at full strength. So Corey Coleman's back at it. Shock Linwood's back at it. Pick your starting quarterback, Thomas. We got the Baylor Bears at full strength against Louisville.
I feel like a Big 12 homer for just choosing Big 12 teams, but I'd have to give the edge to Baylor. Louisville, in my opinion, is a team on the rise. So if this game were to take place in 2017, 2016, it might be a different story, especially with the emergence of Lamar Jackson, their new quarterback, who really looked impressive in the latter half of the season. And Louisville finished on a high note with their win against Texas A&M. But if you're going full strength, I'd have to give it to Baylor. Their offense, and this is something I didn't bring up in the previous matchup we just talked about, you'd have to give these fast-paced offenses the advantage in style of play, because the ACC does have a handful of high-tempo teams, but it's not as prevalent as it is in the Big 12. And, there's not a sane person in the country who could argue that Baylor has a lack of talent or a lack of scheme. Under Art and Kendall Briles, their offense is one of the most potent in the NCAA. So I would have to give the edge to Baylor.
This might be the spot where the ACC is showing a bit of lack of depth. Louisville as a 4 seed. Actually, they're the 5 seed. I took out Pitt. That's right, because of my format there. They're actually technically the 5 seed. I think they're probably a better team than Pitt. I had to take out Pitt as a surprising number 4 seed because they finished at 6-2 in the ACC. But we got Louisville taking on Baylor, Sean.
Yeah, and this kind of points out that this is kind of a top-heavy portion of the Big 12 right now, because, as we pointed out, Oklahoma State was a surprising team and maybe not quite as deserving as that number 2 spot. They were supposed to be in this number 4 spot. That would make this game more interesting. Baylor, TCU, they were going to be vetting for the top 2 spot. And so you have essentially a number 2 seed going against a number 4/5 right now. And to me, it's not even a contest considering Baylor's proficiency on offense. You get Seth Russell back. You get Corey Coleman back, Shaq Linwood, possibly the greatest Big 12 offensive line in history. And if you even want to look at defense to stop Louisville's mobile quarterback, you have freaks, Sean Oakman, Andrew Billings, Trayvon Blanchard even, very underrated safety, nickelback, bear back. That's what they call him. Very athletic that I think that they could stop anything that Louisville could put on the offensive side. I go with Baylor landslide.
Yeah, Louisville doesn't really boast any big-time playmakers on the outside right now. Brandon Radcliffe at running backs, a serviceable back, but as you mentioned, Thomas, it was Lamar Jackson coming on, playing much better as a dual-threat quarterback. He still has a lot to learn, but really improved from game 1 to the end of the season. I just think Louisville would have all sorts of trouble scoring in this game, and I think Baylor, despite Louisville, you think Bobby Petrino, you think Louisville, you think throwing the ball all over the lot, exotic schemes, but basically this Louisville team hung its hat on front 7 on defenses, specifically the defensive line. So I like Baylor to win this game against Louisville. So we got a clean sweep. And just to remind everyone, Pitt the 4 seed, Duke the 7, Syracuse the 11, BC the 14 out of it for the ACC. So we drop down to a Miami-West Virginia game that harkens back to the old Big East. So Thomas, who do you like in this matchup with Miami and West Virginia?
Just looking at it from an eye test, I'd have to give it to West Virginia. Miami, obviously, we're all familiar with the struggles of this past season. And then they lose against, I believe it was Washington State. Am I correct? And that was a heartbreaker. And I think Miami is on the rise as well. You look at them in a couple of years, I think they'll be back to where they were couple of years ago, winning a lot of games, but I'd have to give that one to West Virginia. West Virginia is a team who didn't wow me offensively this past season. Dana Holgorsen has kind of changed and evolved his offense to more of a pro style, kind of in the way that Mike Gundy has done with OSU, but you'll see fullbacks, in many situations you'll see 2 fullbacks. So I don't see this game being very high scoring, but I'd have to give the edge to West Virginia.
All right, Sean, we got a West Virginia team that won a big bowl game, one of the more entertaining games of the postseason against Arizona State. And as Thomas mentioned, Miami went down and played in the snow in El Paso, Texas against Washington State. Couldn't get the job done in that one.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring up something as a recurring theme right now. We always talk about the injuries coming back, and since we're not associated with the ACC, we can't talk about too much about their injuries, but there's a huge injury for the Mountaineers with Carl Joseph. Mm-hmm. Bringing him back makes this a huge turnover team. They were one of the best. I think they were the number 1 for the first 8 weeks or so, and then Joseph got injured earlier in the season and really took them down the notch. And then you have Skyler Howard, who I anticipated to be a great quarterback, and he showed glimpses of that, and especially in the bowl game against West Virginia, against Arizona State. So if that Skyler Howard shows up along with the Wendell Smallwood and I'm losing the other running back, but the running back duo was an incredible asset to this team, and it just depends on who comes up. I would take West Virginia just banking on the best Skyler Howard you can have and Carl Joseph picking off a fairly weak Bradley Kaya.
Okay, so if we're going quarterbacks, I'm going to trust Brad Kaya a little bit more. The issue with Miami this season was offensive line. So Kaya's not a dual threat guy by any stretch, but he's nimble. He can move around in the pocket. But Miami really suffered because they couldn't pass protect for Brad Kaya. So if they have those issues against West Virginia, they're not going to win that game. Boy, I know that West Virginia played fairly well against some of the better teams, but also got blown out against some of the better teams. In the Big 12, Miami had that one just unraveling against Clemson at home, 58-0, and it looked like their season was going to come unraveled. Al Golden got canned the next day. They were looking at a fairly tough stretch of Duke and Pitt and some decent teams down the stretch where they could have lost like 7 games, but they didn't. They pulled it together and finished 8-4 before the Bull lost to Washington State. I'm going to go with Miami in a close one against West Virginia in this one. All right, so next we go with Virginia Tech, a team that won a bowl game over Tulsa. Not a whole lot to go on there. They gave up 45 points in the game. I think they gave up actually 50. I think that was a 55-52 game. Excuse me, against Tulsa. We think Virginia Tech defense and special teams, and they got ravaged in the fourth quarter by a Golden Hurricanes that is not very good. Taking on Texas Tech, we saw what happened to them in the second half against LSU, but considering the talent on the field, it's much more understandable. So, Thomas, we got Virginia Tech at 7-6, taking on a Texas Tech team that also finished at 7-6.
This one, it's not the most exciting game, but it would, in my opinion, be close, especially if you watch how both teams played at the end of the season. The one thing with Virginia Tech, the knock on them is that they really couldn't score. I mean, they're a defensive-oriented team, but they proved that was not true against Tulsa. Now, albeit Tulsa doesn't have the best defense, but they scored 55 points in a bowl game, and that was impressive. And they have a lot of offensive talent: Bucky Hodges, Isaiah Ford, Trayvon McMillan. They have the talent there, and their defense, led by Bud Foster, a college football veteran. I would have to give the edge to Virginia Tech, a team who went 6-6. They're a solid team in the ACC. Texas Tech, obviously, they have a talented offense led by Pat Mahomes. And Patrick Mahomes is one of the most underrated quarterbacks, in my opinion. And he plays with heart and he plays with fire. And it's just really fun to watch him. But then you look at the defensive side, and there's really not much to look at defensively for Texas Tech. So I'd have to give the edge to Virginia Tech in this one.
Okay. Sean, a couple 7-win teams going at it. Neutral field here. Virginia Tech, Texas Tech.
Okay, so neutral field, you can't really consider the near win over TCU, but that has to play in your mind a little bit. But as Thomas kind of noted, Texas Tech, amazing on offense, terrible on defense. That's the inverse for Virginia Tech. Frank Beamer, great coach, and if this was his last game, you would expect them to play with a little bit more heart to get this win. But looking at the game against Tulsa, Tulsa is essentially a lesser Texas Tech. They have a lot of talent and coaches coming from Baylor, and Baylor, Texas Tech, pretty synonymous offensively. And Cliff Kingsbury's proven that he can score on just about anybody. They were just hanging in tight with LSU for a while, and then the pedal came off and things went off. So I'm going to go Texas Tech. I think that they could just score. They'll let Virginia Tech score too, but they just can keep outpacing.
Virginia Tech brought back a defense that upset Ohio State and Columbus, the team that won the national championship. They were very excited about what they had coming back. They had a couple NFL corners in Kendall Fuller and Bradley Faison. Fuller got hurt early in the season, so we bring him back. They have a tremendous front four on defense. Texas Tech, yeah, awful on defense, but I just don't see Virginia Tech taking advantage of that. I definitely hear what you're saying, Thomas, with Bucky Hodges at tight end, and Isaiah Ford's an excellent wide receiver. Actually became the first receiver in the history of the school to gain 1,000 yards in a season. But I just don't see enough offense for Virginia Tech, and I'm usually going with the defense here, but I don't think this is a stellar, hokey defense. So I like Texas Tech, precision passing game, scoring points, and getting the job done against Virginia Tech. All right, then we got NC State, a team that kind of took not that they're on the level of Baylor, but the Baylor formula of you play nobody for 4 non-conference games, or 3 in the Big 12, but 4 for them. And then they got knocked around against the better teams in the ACC. They put up a fight against Clemson, played a good game there. They only went 3-5 in the ACC. They got annihilated in their bowl game against Mississippi State. And they're taking on Texas. And Texas, I think, is a huge wild card here. So, Thomas, we'll start with you with Texas and NC State.
This one's tough. Texas, their offense does not wow me. Now, it depends on who's playing. You know, if they have their starting quarterback, that's one that you have to watch out for. But I don't know. You look at North Carolina State, on the other hand, led by Jacoby Brissett. He's a talent quarterback. He's a precision quarterback, and their offense was really fun to watch. It was kind of a Boise State-esque offense, a lot of shifting, motion, misdirection. One that I really enjoyed watching in their bowl game. And Texas, they're a wild card. They beat Baylor. They lost some pretty ugly games this year. So I would have to give the edge, and I'm just doing this so people don't think I'm a Big 12 homer. I'm going to give it to North Carolina State.
Come on, Thomas. Tell us who you think's going to win this game.
I would have to say North Carolina State. I just think Texas didn't prove to me that they're consistent, and neither was NC State. You know, they lost to Louisville, Virginia Tech, Clemson, Florida State. But I'm going to probably be in the minority, but I'll give it to the Wolfpack here.
All right, Sean, Texas and North Carolina State.
Yeah, I have to side with Thomas a little bit that it's a toss-up for sure. And I really don't know who would win. It's about 50-50 right now. But if you really want to look at the talent-wise, you have to say that if a Texas team that can beat Oklahoma at full strength, I would think that if things click right, that Charlie Strong could save his job and beat this ACC team. I mean, the Baylor win is something, but they were coming in incredibly depleted on offense, losing their quarterback when we're working with a wide receiver at quarterback for the majority of the game and almost lost it. So that kind of weakens that argument a little bit. The Oklahoma game, though, is the one they have to point to. The Notre Dame game, that's the inverse of this. Terrible team, but that they finally figured out things towards the end of the season. I give the edge just by a little bit to Texas Tech because of their renowned recruiting.
See, North Carolina State, as I alluded to off the top, I think is the classic example of taking advantage of a bad schedule. And they play in a division with Clemson and Florida State, so they always have to knock heads with them. But they also have BC, and they've got Wake, and they've got Syracuse. So they knock those wins off the table. They knock out 4 easy non-conference games, while Texas loads up with the likes of Notre Dame and Cal outside of the conference. And that Oklahoma game, I know it's a bit of an aberration, but I think that's just Texas talent coming through. Now, Texas, if they go out there and they play to their inabilities, like we saw against Iowa State, and they get shut out by the Cyclones 24-0, well, that can be the result. But North Carolina State showed me nothing against any good teams. So I like Texas to beat North Carolina State. And I guess all these games should theoretically be toss-ups to a certain extent. So it shouldn't be surprising that these are generally tough to call. But that's kind of the last in the line of the postseason teams, although we've got Texas jumping K-State, even though the Wildcats went to a bowl game. And that's our next matchup with Virginia, lowly regarded in the ACC, but still way ahead of Georgia Tech and Wake and Boston College, a team that, get this, I thought this was the toughest non-conference schedule in the country. Virginia schedule, Notre Dame, UCLA, and Boise State. Rough. And they're taking on Kansas State, who doesn't schedule anyone out of conference. So what do you think, Thomas?
This one's tough. You know, Virginia struggled. They went 4-8. But, you know, those 3 out of conference losses, they didn't play anyone. They actually only lost 34-27 against Notre Dame. So that was a close one. But I would have to give the edge here to Kansas State. You think of KSU, their style of play, Cody Cook in what I would compare to a single wing offense, you know, a lot of quarterback runs, quarterback power. It'd be a low scoring game in this situation. But, you know, if you just look at records, you'd have to give it to Kansas State. And I'd look at it from a perspective of a low scoring game. But I'd have to give the edge to the better team record wise, which is Kansas State.
Okay, Sean, Kansas State went 6-6. They took on Arkansas. The final score didn't look good, but it was like 28-23 at some point late third quarter. So it was a decent game for 3 quarters against a Razorback team that's pretty well regarded. Virginia and K-State.
And I have to first voice that I'm a little disappointed that the format changed. The first format had Georgia Tech going against Kansas State, and I would have loved to see that game. Tech was one of the teams that Tech was one of the teams that I really regarded coming into the season. I don't know what the heck happened to Justin Thomas and that triple option, how that didn't succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But I would love to see them work at full force against this really slow-moving Bill Snyder offense. So I would have liked to see those two contrasts. But I'd have to give the nod to Kansas State. They're another team that was really hit by the injury bug. They lost Dante Barnett and a few other defensive players that really could have made this a stronger defense. They lost their 3 quarterbacks, had to land on Joe Huebner. So you have to imagine one of those quarterbacks that they lost at the beginning of the year, first game, could have helped a little bit. And we always kind of put Kansas State down because of their struggle at quarterback, and that really explains part of it. They weren't supposed to be stellar quarterbacks, but ones that could at least do more than, as Thomas said, work a single wing offense. Huebner did okay, but I think that they could do better eventually. And just to say flat out, I take Kansas State.
All right, I'm going to go with the theory that we talked about concerning Texas. I'm going to take Virginia at its best. And I watched the fourth quarter against Notre Dame. That was at Virginia. So that has to be taken into consideration. But it took Deshaun Kaiser and Will Fuller completing a remarkable over-the-shoulder play from midfield with 13 seconds left after Virginia went the length of the field to convert a touchdown to take a lead in that game against Notre Dame. So they played really well there. If you look at their 3-5 conference record, hey, if they take the route of NC State, they're playing in postseason play because they run over 4 bad teams in conference and they're 7-5, but they didn't. And they went 3-5 in the conference just like NC State and played fairly well and competitive. So I like Virginia. I think they've got more talent, more speed than Kansas State, but it's certainly a toss-up game against the Wildcats there. So now it gets rather ugly. So the Big 12 reps with Iowa State here. And we got Georgia Tech, and Sean did a nice job of wrapping up the Georgia Tech season, coming off 10 wins, the Orange Bowl victory over an SEC team, Mississippi State, finishing in the top 10, and then thud. Wow, they finished 3-9 this past season, Thomas. So we got Georgia Tech taking on Iowa State.
I would have to give the edge to Iowa State here, not because I don't have confidence in Georgia Tech, and I don't. I mean, they went 3-9. They struggled. But Iowa State was a team that scares me. That scared me. I mean, specifically, you look at how they played some teams, specifically OSU. I mean, I watched that one all the way through. And they have talent. You know, Mangino's not he's not calling plays anymore, obviously, but they have talent. You think of, just from a receiving standpoint, you have Lazard, Bundridge, Montgomery, a lot of talent there. And then Mike Warren is someone who scares me. He is a running back who kind of got underlooked coming out of high school. Didn't get looked out by OU or OSU, and he got picked up by Iowa State, and he is going to be in probably first or second team All Big 12 by the time he leaves Iowa State. So I'd just give the edge to ISU in this one, but I think it'd be an ugly game. I think there'd be a lot of points scored, but it's not one that necessarily a whole lot of people would be clamoring to watch.
All right, Sean, Georgia Tech, you talked about the plight of Paul Johnson's team after a big 2014 taking on the Cyclones.
And Mark, I'm as big of Iowa State supporter as they come, but I'm going to go with Georgia Tech right now. Looking at how, I really wish I could pick apart what happened to this Georgia Tech team, but the Yellow Jackets were one of the most explosive teams at the beginning of the year. Iowa State, they have something of an offense, and I really like what they were doing when they finally got rid of Mangino, especially. But I'm going to have to give the edge because I don't know if their defense can hold up to Tech's triple option. It's something that they kind of struggled against with Baylor, another mobile team. It was a crazy weather game, so that kind of played into it a little bit. But I think that there's too much mobility with the Yellow Jackets that they couldn't quite keep up. So I'm going to give the edge to Tech.
I was scrambling to come up with the Georgia Tech schedule here. I know that, again, they were tabbed to be a top 25, fringe top 25 team. They lost most of their running backs that are key in the option offense that they run. And so they had a rough go in 2015 here at 3-9. So I still think Georgia Tech's a more athletic, more gifted team, higher in the recruiting rankings. So I'm going to trust the talent against Iowa State and go with the Ramblin' Wreck there. All right, and finally, at the bottom of the barrel, we would go with Boston College. They didn't win a game in the ACC, but we knocked them out in favor of a Wake team that, get this, if you didn't know this, defeated BC 3-0.
Yep.
He had the ball like 5 times inside the 10-yard line, but either got knocked back by penalties and missed a field goal, or I know at the end of the game they went for it and didn't get it. They lost 3-0 to Wake, so Wake gets the nod here against KU. Thomas.
I'd have to give this to Wake Forest only because they're not Kansas. I mean, I know that sounds awful, but Kansas, they struggled offensively. They struggled defensively. They had the 124th worst rush defense in the country. That's out of 127 teams. And Wake Forest, offensively, they were nothing special. John Walford, their quarterback, he threw 9 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. So, he's got some work to do. But I'd have to give it to Wake Forest just because Kansas is Kansas in 2015. That's all I have to say about that.
Sean, they didn't win a game. Kansas and Wake.
I know they didn't win a game. We all want to see the toilet bowl. This might be it. Close to it, at least. And I'm really wondering when it's going to happen when we cannot refer to Kansas as Kansas. I'm wondering when that's going to start to not become the excuse. But right now it suffices that it's a fairly valid excuse for a team that couldn't even beat a South Dakota State team, an FCS team. Strong one at that. One that probably should be playing D1 in the FBS. But they were a team plagued by injuries, and even before that, they were still kind of weak coming into the season. So I have to give the edge by default to Wake.
I'm right there with you. Wake did win 3 games. They did play some fairly close games. They gave Indiana a decent game out of conference. They beat Boston College. So they did show capable of winning against somebody in the Power 5. And so I got to go with Wake over Kansas. I just think Kansas brings things to a new level of incapability, ineptitude, we'll say.
So not even a word.
That's the final board right there. So KU may have really cost the league here.
Ooh.
So if we mixed up all these teams, and we'll include the other 4 from the ACC, is there a game that you guys would like to see? You guys can talk about that particular game while I do some addition here.
I'd like to see Clemson TCU at full strength. That one interests me. Offenses are similar in style when it comes to, spread, although Clemson's more of a misdirection power offense. Kind of reminds me of a Delaware wing tee, and it has a lot of those influences in there. And then TCU is more of a run and shoot-esque air raid offense, typical of the Big 12. That one is really interesting to me. In that situation, I'd probably have to give the edge to Clemson just because their defense would be superior to TCU's. Even at full strength, the Horned Frogs had a lot of inexperience, specifically at the secondary. So I'd give the edge to Clemson, but it'd sure be a fun game to watch.
Who would you like to see play, Sean?
I think we all just want to see the top teams play, and the top echelon teams, TCU, Clemson, that kind of goes – that's kind of a given right now. I would kind of want to see, just because of the coaches, Virginia Tech, Kansas State. I just would love to see those 2 old classic coaches, Beamer versus Snyder, and see how that plays out. Old school smash mouth football.
Sean, you prove it over and over. You've got an old soul for such a young guy. You've got a mindset toward historical value. I appreciate that. So in our matchups, we got 10 games here. There's 3 of us, so we've got hypothetically 30 matchups. In the Big 12, won 18 of 30. So we think that's pretty representative of the disparity between these two leagues?
For the most part.
Yeah.
I want to see what the ACC thinks about this.
Yeah, I think the Big 12 right now, they argue parity very often. And, teams even in the middle of the pack still have the potential to beat quality teams. I'm not saying that the ACC can't do that, but one could make the argument that they're a little top-heavy. But, even so, they still have a lot of talent, with Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina. And then teams like Duke. Duke's, I really liked watching Duke this past season. And I think that Virginia Tech is a team to pay attention to, especially with a new head coach coming in. So I think the ACC will be a little bit more balanced next year, but it's certainly a conference to watch, but so is the Big 12.
All right, very good. It's Big 12 breakdown, and we match up the Big 12 against the other Power 5. So we did it last week against the Pac-12 and had a 20-20 score. And this week, the Big 12 gets the better of the ACC at 18-12. Let's keep in mind that the two leagues played just twice this past season. Of course, Clemson in the big one against Oklahoma in the college football playoff wins by 20, but Baylor gets a little payback for the Big 12 against North Carolina. There is one game scheduled for next season between the Big 12 and the ACC. We've got Pitt going to Oklahoma State in a decent little matchup on September 17th. All right, for Thomas Fleming from Cowboys Ride for Free and also Sean Cordy from Today's You. Guys, I appreciate you jumping on.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.